"Spend just one night with me," the Vampire King vowed, "and I'll grant you your freedom, but every freedom comes at a cost." Elin first heard those words in a corridor that smelled of winter roses and clean stone, spoken so softly she wondered afterward if the palace itself had whispered them. She had been kneeling to scrub a line of wax from the floor, nothing heroic, nothing dramatic, when the air cooled as if a cloud had passed over the moon. The steward stood at the far end of the hall with a lantern shaded in blue glass, and behind him, at a respectful distance that still felt too near, a tall figure paused where the corridor bent toward the sealed royal wing. Elin didn't look up right away. Her brush moved in small circles. She kept her breath even because she had learned that the palace listened to fear the way a cat listens to footsteps. The figure didn't come closer. It didn't need to. The presence of the Vampire King in his own palace was like gravity. You could pretend it wasn't there, but you adjusted to it with every step. The steward cleared his throat, the sound carefully ordinary. "The king has made you an offer," he said, as though he were reading the day's menu. "If you accept, you will be released at dawn." Released? Elin's brush stopped. For a moment the corridor felt wider than it was, the ceiling higher, the cold stone under her knees more real than ever. She had come to this palace in a hired cart with 2 other women and a crate of linens, believing the rumors that the Vampire King paid well for human hands. She had not known that paid could still mean kept. She stood slowly, wiping her fingers on her apron. "I didn't ask to be brought here," she said, because it was the only sentence she could find that didn't tremble. "No," the steward agreed, and his honesty made it worse. "You were purchased from a debt broker. Your contract is informal." A month ago she would have argued, would have cried, would have tried to throw words like stones at a wall that wouldn't break. Now she only felt the small, familiar sting of dignity being tested, like a tender place that healed and reopened every day. "What does he want?" she asked, and surprised herself by keeping her voice level. The steward looked past her shoulder, as though the answer might be written on the stones. "One night of your company," he said. "Conversation. Presence. Nothing more is required. But the king insists you understand, every freedom comes at a cost." The figure at the bend did not move. The lantern's blue light did not reach it. Elin realized, absurdly, that she could not even be sure she was looking at a face. "I'll think," she said. The steward inclined his head, as if she were already a person with choices. "You have 3 nights," he replied. "Then the offer is withdrawn." When they had gone, the corridor seemed to warm again, as if the palace exhaled. Elin knelt and returned to her scrubbing, because the wax was still there and the world did not pause for any human's confusion. Yet her hands moved differently. Each circle of the brush felt like a question. That was the first mystery, not the offer itself, but why it had been given to her, Elin, the woman who folded sheets, who mended cuffs, who carried warm water up narrow stairs. She was not brave in the way stories honored. She had no magic, no hidden lineage, no secret knife. She had only a stubborn habit of doing what needed doing. Her second mystery was smaller, and it was the one she could touch. Her left shoe had split at the seam. It would have been easy to laugh at herself for noticing a shoe when freedom had been dangled like a lantern in fog, but the shoe mattered. The palace's floors were cold, and Elin spent most of her days walking them in silence. A split shoe meant a wet sock, a blister, a limp, small humiliations that piled up until even simple work felt like pleading. That afternoon, she carried her shoe to the workroom where the servants mended what the palace wore out. The room was bright with candlelight and lined with shelves of thread. A young vampire named Lysa sat by the window alcove, though the glass showed only moonlight and drifting cloud. Lysa's hair was dark and pinned severely, her face composed in that careful way the palace vampires wore like a uniform. She handled a needle with perfect, distant precision. Elin had learned that not all vampires in the palace drank blood. Some did, yes, and the humans were warned where not to go and when. But most, like Lysa, lived on something else: night sap from special trees grown under glass, tinctures brewed in locked rooms, and the strange, old courtesy that held the palace together. Lysa glanced up. "Your shoe," she observed. "It's splitting," Elin said. "I can mend it myself if you'll lend me a stronger thread." Lysa opened a drawer and slid out a spool without comment. Then, after a pause that felt like Lysa weighing whether kindness was permitted, she added, "You were summoned to the corridor." It wasn't a question, but Elin heard it as one. "Yes," Elin said, and surprised herself again by not lowering her voice. Secrets in a palace never stayed secret anyway, they only grew heavier. "He offered to let me leave." Lysa's needle paused mid-stitch. Her eyes, dark, unreadable, rested on Elin's face as if searching for a familiar shape and not finding it. "And you will go," she said. It sounded like an assumption, not encouragement. Elin looked down at her torn shoe. "Wouldn't you?" she asked. Lysa's mouth tightened, the closest she came to a frown. "I have lived here for 83 years, she said quietly. "I do not remember the taste of wind in a field. I do not know if I would want it, or if it would only remind me what I can't keep." Elin threaded her needle. The stronger thread felt rougher between her fingers. "Then why stay?" she asked, and felt the question turn, unexpectedly, into one she was asking herself. Lysa's gaze drifted to the window where the moonlight made a pale pool on the floor. "Because this palace is a promise," she said. "And because leaving is also a promise. Both have costs." Elin stitched the seam, careful and slow. The act steadied her in a way thinking never did. If she pulled too hard, the leather would tear. If she pulled too softly, the seam would split again. It was not so different from living under a king you rarely saw. The work was in the tension. In the days that followed, Elin watched her life more closely than she had before, as if she were trying to decide whether it was worth carrying out of the gates. She rose in the late afternoon, because the palace ran on night hours. She hauled water, folded bed linens, dusted shelves that held ancient books no one opened in front of humans. She traded quiet jokes with Sarah, a kitchen girl who sang under her breath while slicing pears. She shared her bread with Thomas, the gardener, who had once been a schoolmaster and now tended the moonlit conservatory as if the roses were students who needed patience more than instruction. Thomas was the one who made Elin's small problems feel dignified again. When he saw her mended shoe, he nodded as if she had repaired something important. "A good stitch," he said. "It'll hold." "Nothing lasts forever," Elin answered, and immediately wished she hadn't. Thomas's hands, brown, lined, gentle, rested on the handle of his spade. "No," he agreed. "But a not forever isn't the same as a not at all." They walked between the glasshouse rows where pale vines climbed trellises. Under the glass, a kind of night lilac bloomed with faint silver petals. Thomas picked one, then stopped himself and set it back without breaking it. He treated the living things here as if they had consent to give. "You look as though you've been offered a door," he said. Ili's throat tightened. I have, she admitted. And you're afraid to walk through it, he guessed, without judgment. Ili stared at the lilacs. What if the cost is me, she whispered. What if I leave and I'm not the same person? What if I agree to whatever he means by one night, then I have to swallow it for the rest of my life? Thomas leaned on the spade. Freedom always changes us, he said. So does staying. Don't ask whether you'll be changed. Ask whether you'll be changed into someone you can respect. That night Ili lay in her narrow bed and listened to the palace. It creaked as old wood does. Somewhere distant, water fell in a fountain. The clock bell, an instrument that chimed not by hours but by the shifting of the moon behind clouds, sounded once. She imagined the gates at the edge of the courtyard, ironwork braided like vines. She imagined walking through them at dawn into a world that might not remember her, a world where her old debt-broker might still exist, where her mother's house might now belong to strangers. In the palace, at least, she was known. Not cherished, not honored, known. Sarah would notice if she didn't come to the kitchen. Thomas would leave a cup of warm herb tea by the conservatory door. Even Lysa, in her rigid quiet, would lift her eyes when Ili entered a room, as if keeping track mattered. Ili's thoughts returned to the offer. One night. Company. Conversation. Presence. There was something in the promise that felt less like desire and more like loneliness, but she didn't want to romanticize it. A king could be lonely and still be dangerous. A king could speak softly and still take what he wanted. Ili had grown up among men who smiled as they counted coins. On the second day of her 3, Ili went to the library corridor, one of the few places the servants passed but never lingered. The shelves rose higher than a house, and ladders rolled along rails like silent beasts. Humans were allowed to dust the lower shelves under supervision, but never to read. Ili had accepted this rule the way she accepted locked doors, as part of the palace's shape. Lysa was there, cataloguing a stack of ledgers with ink as black as dried berries. Ili approached with a cloth in her hands and dusted slowly, giving herself time to gather courage. What happens to humans who leave? Ili asked at last. Lysa's pen paused. If they are truly released, she said, they are escorted beyond the river. They are given coin. They are given papers that say they were employed, not kept. And the cost? Ili pressed. Lysa's gaze flicked up, sharp now. The cost is not always extracted by force, she said. Sometimes it is the part of yourself you offer because you think you must. Sometimes it is the part you refuse to offer, and you live with the refusal. Ili set her cloth down. Do you know why he chose me? She asked. Lysa looked away, and for a moment her composure slipped into something almost human, reluctance. Because you speak to people as if they are people, she said. Even when you are frightened. Even when you are tired. The king values that. He does not have much of it in his life. Ili swallowed. That sounds like a compliment, she said, unsure whether to accept it. It is an observation, Lysa replied, and then, after a pause, softened. And perhaps a warning. If you go to him, go as yourself. Don't go as a bargain. That evening Sarah found Ili folding towels and nudged her with an elbow. You're quiet, she said. Ili hesitated. She had learned that fear shared became lighter, but it also became real. I've been offered release, she said finally. Sarah's eyes widened, then narrowed. "And you don't look happy," she said, practical as always. "I don't know what he'll ask," Elin admitted. Sarah set down a stack of towels and wiped her hands on her skirt. "Listen," she said, lowering her voice even though they were alone. "If you go, go with your spine straight. If you don't go, don't spend the rest of your life imagining you should have. Either choice is yours. Don't let the palace take that too." When Elin returned to her room, she sat at the small desk by the wall and wrote a letter on a scrap of kitchen paper. She didn't have anyone to send it to beyond the palace, no address, no certainty her mother was alive, but writing it felt like placing a candle in a dark space. "If I come home," she wrote, "I will come home as myself. If I do not, I will still be myself." On the third night, Elin asked the steward to deliver her answer. "I accept," she said. Then, before her courage could thin, she added, "But I will not be alone with him in a closed room. I will sit with him in the winter hall, where there are windows. I will speak, and he will listen. That is the night. Nothing else." The steward's eyebrows rose slightly, but he did not laugh. "You set terms," he said. "I'm a person," Elin replied, surprised by the steadiness of her voice. "Not a price." The steward studied her, then nodded once. "I will inform him," he said, and walked away as if she had done something ordinary. The winter hall was a long chamber with a ceiling painted in pale constellations. Its windows were tall and shuttered, not to keep light out. There was no sun in the palace at this hour, but to keep warmth in. A hearth burned with slow, blue-white logs that gave off little smoke. The air smelled of cedar and cold iron. Elin entered with the steward and stopped just inside. 2 candle stands had been lit, their flames steady as if protected by unseen hands. A single chair waited by the hearth, and another across from it. No chains. No guards. Only the hush of a place used to secrets. The king was already there, standing near the far wall where the painted stars faded into shadow. He did not step forward. He did not offer a hand. He simply inclined his head, a gesture so controlled it might have been courtesy or calculation. Elin sat first, because her legs felt unreliable. The steward retreated without sound, leaving the door not fully closed. The king's voice, when it came, was low and even. "You asked for windows," he said. "They are shuttered, but they are there." "I asked for a room that remembers the outside," Elin replied, and heard her own boldness with a kind of calm astonishment. "Windows do." Silence gathered. Elin realized then that she had imagined this night as something she would endure. Instead it was something she would choose, moment by moment, like breathing. "I was told you wanted company," she said. "I can give you that. But I want to understand the cost." The king moved slightly, enough for firelight to touch the edge of his face, pale skin, dark hair, eyes like deep water that did not reflect the flames. He looked older than any man she had known, but not in the way age softened. In the way mountains were old. "The cost," he said, "is that you will be remembered." Elin frowned. "I'm already remembered," she said cautiously. "By the servants. By the steward." "Not as you are," he replied. "Not with the full weight of you. Vampires do not forget the taste of a night. Humans do. You will walk out at dawn and build a life, and someday you will be old, and this palace will still be standing. And I will still be here. And you will have been a flame that warmed the room for a little while. Ili listened, letting his words settle. It wasn't a threat. It was something stranger, an admission that time was uneven here, that her life was brief beside his. "And what do you take from me?" she asked. "Because that's what people mean when they say cost." The king's gaze rested on her hands, still marked with soap roughness and thread pricks. "A story," he said. "One true thing from your life. Not the polished kind. The kind you carry when you think no one sees." Ili felt her throat tighten in a different way than fear. In the palace, she had guarded her memories the way she guarded her name. They were hers, the only possessions no one could inventory. To offer one felt intimate in a way touch was not. She thought of refusing. She could get up. She could decide that freedom was not worth the giving. Then she thought of Thomas's question, "Someone you can respect." Ili drew a slow breath. "All right," she said. "But I choose which story. And you do not repeat it to anyone." The king's head inclined again. "Agreed." Ili stared into the hearth. The blue-white flames reminded her of moonlight on river stones, and suddenly she knew what she would give, not because it was the prettiest memory, but because it was the one that had shaped her without anyone noticing. "When I was 10, she began, "my mother took in a stray dog. It wasn't ours. It was thin and half-wild, and it snapped when you tried to touch it. The neighbors said it would bite a child. They said to chase it off." She swallowed and forced herself to continue, gently, steadily, as if she were mending a seam. "My mother fed it anyway. She set food down and stepped back. She did that every day for weeks. She didn't name it at first, because she said names were promises and she didn't know if it would stay." Ili's eyes burned, but she did not let herself cry. Tears were honest, but she wanted to tell the story with her spine straight. "One day I got impatient," Ili said. "I wanted the dog to love us. I wanted it to be grateful. I reached for it too fast and it bit me. Not badly. Just enough to draw blood. I was furious. I said it didn't deserve kindness." She glanced up. The king had not moved. He listened with a stillness that did not feel hungry. "My mother washed the bite," Ili continued, "and then she went outside and fed the dog again. Like nothing had changed. Later she told me, kindness isn't a bargain. It's a way of living. If you only do it when it works, it isn't kindness." Ili's voice softened. "The dog stayed. It learned. It slept by the fire. It died when I was 17, old and gentle. I still think about how my mother treated it like it had dignity, even when it didn't know what to do with that." The hall was quiet except for the slow shift of flames. "That's my story," Ili said. "The true thing I carry." The king did not praise her. He did not offer comfort like a performance. He simply said, very quietly, "Thank you." Ili felt, unexpectedly, the cost he had meant, that the story no longer sat only inside her. It had crossed into another mind, another long life. Part of her past would exist in the palace when she was gone. It was a surrender, but it was also a kind of keeping, like planting a seed in soil you would never see again. "And now," Ili said, her hand steady in her lap, "you will keep your vow." The king turned his face slightly toward the shuttered windows, as if acknowledging a boundary. "At dawn," he said, "your papers will be prepared." He did not ask her to stay longer. He did not reach for another story. The distance remained, and in that distance Ellie found relief. She had not been swallowed. She had not been diminished. She had sat in a hall with a king and spoken as herself. When the steward returned to escort her out, Ellie rose without haste. She bowed, not low, not pleading. A simple dip of the head, the kind she might give any elder who had listened well. Then she walked back through the corridors that had once felt like a maze and now felt, for the first time, like a place she could leave. She slept a little before dawn, not deeply but enough to soften the sharp edge of anticipation. When the clock bell chimed its pale note, she dressed in the plainest clothes she owned and tied her mended shoes. She put the unsent letter in her pocket. In the courtyard the air tasted of frost and wet stone. Sarah hugged her quickly, fiercely, then stepped back as if embarrassed by affection. Thomas pressed a small bundle into her hands, bread, dried fruit, a folded scarf that smelled faintly of cedar. Lysa stood at a distance, expression composed, but when Ellie met her eyes, Lysa inclined her head in a gesture that felt like respect. The gate opened without a groan. Beyond it lay the road, silvered by early light. The horizon held the faint promise of sun, though the palace still lived under its careful night. Ellie paused at the threshold and looked back once. The high windows of the royal wing were dark. She did not see the king. She did not need to. She understood then that her freedom had never been only a matter of gates and papers. It had begun the moment she asked for windows, the moment she set a boundary, the moment she chose to give a story rather than let herself be taken. The cost, too, was clear and strangely bearable. She was leaving people behind. She was carrying a memory now shared with a being who would outlast her. She would never again be able to pretend the palace was only rumor. She would have to build a life with the knowledge that monsters could listen, that kindness could be chosen even when it wasn't safe, and that dignity could be stitched back together one careful thread at a time. Ellie drew the scarf around her neck, feeling its warmth. Then she stepped onto the road and walked forward as the dawn slowly opened, not as a girl sold for debt, not as a servant waiting to be dismissed, but as a person who had made a moral choice and survived it whole. Behind her, the palace remained, quiet, mysterious, and distant, like a closed book on a shelf. And Ellie, carrying her one true story and the steady weight of her own courage, went on to write the next pages herself.